Welcome to Acton Unwind, an ongoing conversation on a free and virtuous society. I'm your host, Eric Cohn. I want to thank you for listening, and I want to ask that if you're listening to us on our website, that you navigate right now to the show notes for this episode, where you will find a link to subscribe directly to Acton Unwind at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else where you listen to fine podcasts. And if you like this program, please leave us a 5-star review at Apple Podcasts so as to help more people find our show. I'm joined this week by Anthony Bradley, Distinguished Research Fellow here at the Acton Institute, and Dylan Pauman, Executive Editor of the Journal of Markets and Morality and a Research Fellow here at Acton. This week, we will discuss some free speech internet cases before the Supreme Court and the proposal that actually wasn't a proposal for surge pricing of Wendy's burgers. But first, I'm going to go to Washington, D.C., where on February 25th, a 25-year-old serviceman in the United States Air Force, by the name of Aaron Bushnell, lit himself on fire outside the front gate of the Israeli embassy in Washington, D.C. He live-streamed this over his phone, and immediately prior to setting himself on fire, he said he was protesting against, quote, what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, and declared that, quote, he will no longer be complicit in genocide. After which he doused himself in a flammable liquid and set himself on fire. As he burned, Bushnell repeatedly shouted, "Free Palestine," while a Secret Service officer held him at gunpoint and others attempted to extinguish the fire. He later succumbed to those injuries that evening. Now, the reaction to this, you have seen a lot of people, maybe perhaps most prominently Cornel West, professor at Princeton? It's Princeton, right?
Technically, yes.
Technically, yes. Professor at Princeton, but also currently a Green Party candidate for the presidency of the United States.
Any party he can get.
He is for
depending on the state.
He is the any party.
He's on the ballot.
He is running for president of the United States, who celebrated what Bushnell did. Others celebrated him as well. It did also prompt what I thought was a very revealing amongst the kind of classes that comment on this kind of thing, that many people offered in praise of him rest in power. And then there was a pushback that you apparently are not supposed to say that about a white person, which Aaron Bushnell was, which seems really to miss the entire point of all of this and not the most important thing that we could be arguing over. So we're not going to talk about that, but we will talk about what I found interesting, which was this, one, the celebration here of someone who, while I obviously don't know for sure, did not seem to be mentally well. Typically, mentally well people do not light themselves on fire in the name of protesting a cause like that. So that is one point. The other point would be just, again, the odd way that this was celebrated by people, that, to even offer rest in power or any of those, that this was some great sacrifice that he made. There was a piece, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, but there was a piece in Time that sought to compare this to other incidents. Now, of course, there's the most famous one, which would have been was Vietnam War, correct? Where children of a certain age will know this as being the photo on the cover of the 1992 self-titled album from Rage Against the Machine of this monk who sets himself on fire in the name of protesting. So there's a history of this, but the piece from Time was kind of odd in attempting to point out that there was a Christian tradition of this, that it seemed to get that very, very wrong. So I do want to touch on that at some point in this conversation. But as you observed what happened with Aaron Bushnell and the reaction to it, what stuck out to both of you?
Well, first of all, it's just tragic. It's sad that anyone would throw their life away for something like this. And that's not to make any comment about the cause. I'm sure our listeners are divided on their opinion of what's going on in Israel and Gaza. And I think there are sensible people who want a ceasefire and want peace. But this is a young man in the Air Force. He's got his whole life ahead of him, and he's not living in any sort of desperate circumstances. Most of the time in history, and there's a long history, at least starting in the 20th century, of self-immolation as a form of protest. It's from people in very desperate circumstances. And usually there's a few different kinds of people. There's protests of the Vietnam War, likely, I believe it was Thich Nhat Duc was the monk's name.
That's correct, 1963, set himself on fire in Saigon in protest of the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government, backed by several U.S.
So I'd say
by the U.S., yes.
Yep, I'd say at least half have been Buddhists protesting poor treatment of Buddhists in some pretty terrible situations in the world where it's at least a little more sympathetic that, okay, maybe they just never saw a different future for themselves. They also have a different metaphysic where this makes a little more sense if you're just going to be reborn again. And, there were people in the United States protesting the Vietnam War, again, likely an imitation, I believe, of Thich Nhat Duc. And then there were several instances. The other major category would be people protesting communism. Again, very desperate circumstances in Eastern Europe. And of all of those, the only one that I could confirm who was a Christian was a Lutheran pastor in East Germany protesting the regime there. So that hardly makes a Christian tradition of this. The reference in the Time article in Time's defense was sourced to a New Yorker article, which was terrible. So they at least thought they had a source for what they were claiming. But the New Yorker article, misrepresented the burning of Diocletian's palace in the early 4th century. It did burn, but Eusebius recounts it, and there's no indication that Christians set the fire, and the Christians who died were, in fact, going to be executed. So this may have just simply been the way in which they were executed, or I'd have to look at the text again. But no one set themselves on fire in protest. That was not what happened there. If anything, probably a fire started, and they abandoned the prisoners who may have been there. And what do you know? They blamed the Christians, as was common for pagan emperors who hated Christians in the ancient world. A famous example being Nero, who famously fiddled on a hill outside of Rome he burned whole blocks to expand his palace and then blamed it on Christians, and thus started the first kind of Roman persecution of Christians. So it's something that I don't think really fits with a Christian understanding of the worth of every human being created in the image of God. It's just not something you throw away. And for a young man like this, if he supported this cause and he's a active service member, that's something that he could have been speaking at rallies. He could have been raising money. He could have been, there's all sorts of things he could do. He was not in a desperate situation. So lastly, the one other point, because other people have mentioned this and you brought this up, the question of whether mental illness was involved. It's entirely possible. I don't know. Nobody knows as far as I know. Maybe records will come out. But it's worth pointing out because mental illness is often stigmatized in this way, and I think unfairly so, that studies of cults show that most cult members are not in any way mentally ill or different. They're just lonely people who get some bad ideas in their heads. You have at least some evidence that he has a very kind of weird colonial studies interpretation of what's going on. That's not, again, to make any comment on the conflict, but he has a certain framework that he has accepted, or that he did accept in his mind, that painted the situation in a certain way and that made other interpretations no longer live options. Normal people can fall into that. And it's important, I think, to say that, because it's really easy to write off every bad thing that happens as, oh, what a troubled soul. Well, yeah, troubled soul, but that doesn't mean that, oh, this was untreated mental illness or other mentally ill people are just liable to do the same thing. So I think it's worth stating that as well.
For me, it's been really interesting. If you read a book by David Koyzis, and this is something I'm going to say over and over and over again. He has a book, Political Visions and Illusions, and in that book he notes that in the West, historically, the West has been conditioned about a particular narrative of a man who came to sacrifice himself for other people and for a cause. And so in the West, people are conditioned to be drawn to narratives of transcendence that have some sort of figure, some sort of martyr figure. And when the culture becomes less Christian and less religious, that framework is still in place. And so people are searching for some sort of transcendent narrative where some person, a hero figure, sacrifices himself or herself for a cause or for another group of people. And for me, it's really interesting. I think one of the reasons that people are so celebratory toward this sacrificial act is that it's become a substitute narrative for the life of Christ, for the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so as a replacement narrative, now just insert a cause and insert someone like Mr. Bushnell, right? And so here we have again and again, people longing for transcendence, longing for a narrative that involves a figure who martyrs himself or herself for the sake of some righteous cause. And you just keep swapping that out every 10, 15 years, every war, every whatever. And for me, it's really more of evidence of his potential atheism or maybe his own agnosticism, that he needed this sort of narrative and he needed to insert himself in this narrative. And so people are also celebrating this narrative because the actual narrative, right, the sort of true, transcendent, evidentiary narrative of Christ's life and death and resurrection has been purged from the West. And so we are looking for these replacement narratives. And so it makes sense that Cornel West would be like, yeah, amen. Amen, brother. Right? I mean, that's sort of like, he did it for the cause. And it's going to continue. I think it as we become less Christian as a Western society, people are going to do this thing. And we've seen it already in things like climate change and things like that. So they actually need a cause. And so in this sense, I just see it on the long list of replacement narratives for the life and death and resurrection of Christ.
Yeah, I will read you what Cornel West tweeted here. Let us never forget the extraordinary courage and commitment of Brother Aaron Bushnell, who died for truth and justice. I pray for his precious loved ones. Let us rededicate ourselves to genuine solidarity with Palestinians undergoing genocidal attacks in real time. Which is, again, you can get into a debate over the framing of the issue and the conflict that is currently going on in Gaza. But there is just the perversity of that using this person essentially as a tool. Now, whether he was mentally ill in some way or not, we do not know. But the wording that you use, Dylan, I think is good. Clearly a troubled soul. Whether things weren't working as they properly should upstairs, we do not know. But setting yourself on fire in the name of protesting a cause like this is a pretty clear sign that not everything is well with you. Yeah. It's a celebration of this, and I think, Anthony, you make an interesting point in a way that he's stepping into the Christ role in all of this, and he is dying for the sins that are being committed against the Palestinians, which I know nothing about this person's professed faith or not, but to see it celebrated by certain people and in certain ways is just a rejection of very important Christian principles that says that this person's life had worth and meaning, and that it should not be turned just into a tool of advancing a political cause, or even, whether I agree with this or not, which I completely disagree with Cornel West's framing of the conflict in Israel and Gaza. It is just not, human beings are not tools for us to make more effective arguments and to push for certain political ends or geopolitical ends here on this plane of existence. And there just is something rather disgusting about the way that he is being treated as, a mechanism, as a tool, as a means to an end for a certain cause. And I just find that the celebration of something that, even if it is not an actual case of mental illness, is the case that, like you were describing, Dylan, of the kind of people who get wrapped up into cults and very specific beliefs that drive them to do things that may seem very rational to them, but are irrational to outside observers, to the extent of harming himself, taking his own life, and the harm that is going to do to people who loved and cared about him. The way that this is being celebrated as a tool to advance a political cause is just very, very gross to me.
Yeah, and it dovetails really well with what Anthony said about David Koyzis as well. I mean, I think the lesson here should be that we all need to examine ourselves and our political beliefs and make sure we haven't joined a cult. Because it happens. It happens in less extreme ways all the time, but it happens. And as for Wes' comment, I find it very disappointing, not unfortunately super surprising coming from him. But he is someone who does have faith. He does have a degree in theology. He has taught it. He's a very skewed position on a lot of things that I don't agree with. But the Christian way, that's by everything from the pro-Palestine cause, like accept all their premises. I'm even sympathetic to some of those, but let's not even parse it. Let's just say we accept all of this. It's total one-sided oppression. The Christian approach is Jesus forgiving his persecutors. It is St. Paul seeing a light on the road to Damascus and being transformed from a persecutor into a friend. It is reaching out and finding a way to love your enemies. That is very hard to do. It might be a martyric cause, but hardly in the same way. It's the sort of thing that there is not enough, and we badly need it because this will go on forever until someone makes the first move of turning the other cheek. Even, mercy does not amount to injustice. It does not get rid of any of the claims of saying, well, I'm just now papering this over and saying it was all okay. Mercy is unmerited grace. It is unmerited favor. That's what forgiveness is. There will be no peace in Palestine, in Israel, without that kind of radical forgiveness. That is something worth giving your life for, not in the sense of throwing it away, but of dedicated work and all of the persecution that may come with it.
For me, it's really sad that he felt himself complicit in genocide when he's not complicit in genocide. So it also speaks to the absence of people in his life to give him really good direction. And you're right, Eric. I think it's really sad the way he's been instrumentalized for other people's agendas. My sense is if Aaron had been their own brother or their own son, they probably wouldn't be so enthusiastic about it, right? If that was Cornel West's own son, he would not be celebrating. There's absolutely no way, because it's obviously, I mean, if you think about it in the abstract, it yields no good result, right? You can't impact his desired goal by taking his own life. Absolutely waste of an attempt to protest. And this was something that was so different in the civil rights movement, right? I mean, people were offering themselves in protest, like you said earlier, Dylan. I mean, there was real sacrifice. People were not in positions of thriving, and it was they were willing to do that for the sake of a cause because there was a legitimate opportunity to yield a real effect. And in this context, there absolutely was not. And so I really feel horrible for his friends and his family members, and the absence, I think, of really good direction in his life.
One of the things we do know was he was very involved in a lot of online communities, particularly Reddit, and these kinds of conversations about it, which I think comes back to what you were saying, Dylan. I mean, people recoil from the term cult because it is almost like I don't even know the right way to put it, but like it seems to suggest that someone's in a cult almost sounds a little condescending to them. It's like, they have these niche beliefs, or it invokes, I think, to a lot of people something like Heaven's Gate, right? Like this famous example of people with a very wild belief system. How entirely they got caught up in it are things that I do not understand, but who took their own life in the process of being a part of this cult. And you can be involved in cultish movements or cultish ideas that I think it's a fair description of, but maybe we get caught up by the words so much that we can't actually see the underlying point, which I think you do a good job of making, that it is people who have attach themselves to a set of ideas that frame things in such a certain way that any other way of looking at it is out of bounds. It's just not something that they'll consider or process. In a lot of cases, maybe I'd be so bold as to say it's mostly benign. I mean, we come across people with strange belief systems all of the time. In fact, it's kind of one of the great things about this country is that there has been such a diversity and array of different belief systems that people have. Most of them are fine, if odd to us. Rarely do you see, and this is the reason why you remember specific incidents. You remember Waco. You remember Heaven's Gate. You will possibly remember somebody like Aaron Bushnell, even though it's less identifiable. Typically, cult has religious overtones to it. So it may be a cultish set of beliefs, the way that he was framing this conflict in Palestine, Israel and Palestine. But because we tend to think of it in that Waco Branch Davidians or Heaven's Gate kind of way, it doesn't lend itself as well. But I think that's an important point that you're making, that it is a belief system that is kind of epistemically closed, that doesn't allow for consideration of anything outside of the bounds. And in its worst cases, can we see examples of it leading to people doing the kinds of things like Aaron Bushnell did in taking his own life.
And it's a search for meaning and transcendence in a context where we are bombarded by inputs. And how do you sort through what matters? And you can be radicalized by a group of people on a Discord server, right, who are telling you how to transcend the noise, right? What really matters in terms of what offers the context for meaning and transcendence and purpose and aspirations. And it's really easy, I think, for all of us, as you mentioned, to get caught up in using various communities to give us meaning and transcendence and purpose, other than the things that truly do that in terms of our faith.
I would just like to add a note, also somewhat unrelated. I hope if more of this happens in the future, and I hope no more of it happens in the future, but I hope this sort of thing gets treated a little more like mass shootings, in which we don't repeat the name of the person, we don't spread it around, because one of the big dangers, one of the big criticisms of Dr. West, and I think rightly so, and others like him, is that you glorify this sort of thing and you will find other people imitating it. And for all of the reasons we've been talking about, that would be just further tragedy upon tragedy. Every life matters. And if you believe that about Palestine, please also believe that about your own life.
That is possibly a good topic for us to dive into on another episode. And, of course, I don't want to wait for another terrible, tragic episode. So maybe we'll just schedule it as a point of conversation. But, there is some difference in I agree with the general thrust of your point, and I am in favor of leaving the name of the individuals who do terrible acts like mass shootings out of the coverage of it. I mean, there's the kind of thing that is always discoverable, and there are some interesting questions to be raised about how do you report on incidents like that? How do you cover them properly if that it has to kind of be a collective decision to not mention the name of a person who perpetrates an act like that, because as soon as one place is going to start giving the kind of detailed coverage of the history and the life of the person who did the horrible act, there's an incentive that exists for other media entities to jump on and do the exact same thing. So you have to get everyone to agree and then not break the pact in order to do it. There is somewhat of a difference here. This is somebody, again, your point about not celebrating them and not wanting other people to follow what they do because it was celebrated is well taken. The single individual taking their own life in the cause of protest versus a person who perpetrates an act where they take other people's lives, usually, well, not even usually, but sometimes in the name of a greater cause. I see a little bit of a difference, but there is a question, there is an open question of what is the most appropriate way to discuss and cover these things. And I do not think we've come to a consensus on it. But the point you make is a good one, that you do not. One of the problems I think we have seen, especially when it comes to mass shootings, is that they seem to come in waves. And there's, I don't know the social science behind it, but there undeniably, to me, seems to be a connection with the more these incidents are elevated in the kind of coverage that they receive in the rapid-fire media cycles that exist now, the greater likelihood that people, again, with an epistemically closed set of beliefs, are going to look at that and see the way that the person is glorified is perhaps the wrong word for an incident like a mass shooting, but like their name rings out.
Yeah.
And they're going to desire the same kind of thing.
So I certainly agree mass shootings are worse. But there's no good press for the mass shooter, and yet people still imitate it. Yeah. So I think even in this case that, yes, no one should glorify it. But again, it's one thing to report someone did this. It's another thing to spread their name all around and, have people taking it up for a cause. Well, if anything, I would expect it to be even worse as far as the imitative effects. So hopefully not.
People are looking for ways to define that their lives matter. We have an epidemic in this country of young men who are also trying to discern how their lives matter, why their lives matter, where their lives matter. And there are multiple groups online who take advantage of a generation of men who are lost and need a cause. And unfortunately, in this particular case, he found this as a cause, and he discerned that this is how my life will matter. I will no longer be complicit, right, in genocide. My life matters. And I think the problem with the cascading potential impact is that there will be other guys, young men in particular, who are going to say, if I do something like this, my life will matter. And again, this speaks to the absence in his own life of someone to give him a different story, a different transcendent narrative, so he can understand that his life matters so much that there's a better way to protest than what he did on that day.
Yeah, we should underline the crisis of meaning that clearly afflicts our society and our culture in this day and age. Let's move on to our second topic. A week ago, cases were before the United States Supreme Court that have implications for free speech online. The U.S., I'm going to read here from an article from the BBC. U.S. Supreme Court justices appeared torn on Monday as they heard a landmark pair of cases which could fundamentally alter the future of online free speech. At issue were Republican-backed laws passed in Florida and Texas limiting tech firms' ability to remove political content they deem objectionable. Tech giants said the laws, passed after the 2021 Capitol riot, infringed on their right to editorial discretion. At times, justices seemed unsure of how to apply existing law to tech firms. Industry groups have argued that the laws passed in Florida and Texas violated the right to free speech, which included the freedom of private companies to decide what content to publish on their platforms. Even that framing is a little bit incorrect, and I'll take issue with the BBC on that one. We'll come back to that in a moment. Supporters of the laws say they protect the First Amendment rights of conservative users from censorship by what they imply are left-leaning tech companies. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution protects the freedom of speech and expression of American citizens from being censored by the government. These are, to me, some of the key points that were just kind of highlighted there by the BBC. One, there is, to me, a massive misunderstanding about the role that these entities play. Like even, I can't remember which podcast it was I was listening to, but the dichotomy in which it got forced into is like, are they a publisher like a newspaper, or are they more like a public utility? And the answer for me to that question is they are neither. They are neither of those things. They are not entirely responsible for the editorial content because they're not choosing to publish all of it. They are providing a platform on which other people are able to publish. So if I go on Facebook and I write something libelous about Dylan, the responsible party is me, not Facebook. Whereas if I were a columnist in the Chicago Tribune or on the editorial board of the Chicago Tribune and wrote something libelous about Dylan, it was because the paper chose to publish that. The paper and me individually would have liability for that kind of a case. It's also, again, I'm unpersuaded by the public utility arguments about these things, as I am equally unpersuaded, and I've made this point in previous conversations about this, by the kind of people who make proclamations about how Twitter, or X as I guess it's called now, is the new public square. It's the digital public square. And these always seem to come from the kind of people who I am absolutely certain if they lost their Twitter account, they would die of embarrassment. It takes somebody who is that fatally online in order to think that it has replaced the public square in another meaningful way. I highly encourage those people to go outside and to touch some grass. But again, First Amendment implications, this is not Congress making a law. This is private companies choosing what kind of stuff they want on their platforms. They can choose very, very poorly, but they still have a right to make very poor choices about it because of their nature as private companies. And I'll add one more thing before turning it over to you and getting your thoughts on it. Part of my problem with all of this is similar to it is now the legislative version of what I feel a lot of people on the new right or the NatCon right have been doing for a number of years. I got into a disagreement with a friend of mine who basically made the point of, a lot of these things, they aren't dogma. We can question them, like, free trade relationships with China, for example, or Section 230, which is a very big issue in these cases. It's not gospel. It can be questioned. It can be rewritten if we think that it's wise to rewrite it. And my response to him was to say, I agree with you, but the people you're defending are not operating in the forward way that you're making this argument. What I see is people on the political right who got very, very mad about the fact that they thought the people that run these big tech companies disagree with them politically, and they're largely correct about that, and then decided to work backwards for a rationale of how they can punish those companies for having different political beliefs than they do. That is something that I don't have a whole lot of respect for, because it is not serious about the rule of law. And it is the exact kind of thing that is, even if your case, and I've heard these arguments from new right types, so that like, well, the left does this already. So the answer is to say that we're just going to become what we behold. We're just going to become just like them. This is just the game. It's all power politics now. I'm sorry. To me, that is an abandonment of a sense of principle that used to hold on the right, that I think increasingly is disappearing from the political right, just because, again, they got very, very mad at a handful of companies that disagree with them on their politics.
Yeah. So I think for the most part, people are wrong. I mean, they might be right about left-leaning executives or whatever. They might even be right about, in previous Twitter iterations, certain people were elevated and certain people, their posts were not as likely to show up in someone's feed, that kind of thing. But as far as political, advertisements go, we have laws that are so permissive that things that you could get, if you were a company advertising your product and you made the sort of claims, completely baseless claims that happens in basically every political ad we have, you could be taken to court. We don't allow that in our politics because we're so concerned with having a free polity and having free speech. So, again, I agree with your point. It would be like getting upset that Barry Weiss had published something on her Substack and then getting upset at Substack instead of Barry Weiss and her editorial team, right? So that to me is a bit misplaced. But even in the case of like cable news, they can choose not to sell that airtime to any given campaign. But if they do, they can't censor what is said, right? But that's always been the case, right? And there are more right and left-leaning social media. People always, this is the same sort of thing. About a decade ago, I wrote an article for The Federalist complaining about, I didn't name them in particular, but basically everything The Federalist said about big, mainstream media, because it was self-marginalizing. They were presuming that they weren't part of the media, when of course they are, right? And I went through Fox News, conservative, bigger than MSNBC and CNN combined in terms of viewership, right? How is that not the mainstream media? Wall Street Journal, more subscribers than the New York Times. How is that not mainstream media? The mainstream is diverse. X is owned by Elon Musk, who is weird, but I don't know if left-leaning is accurate. He's mixed. He's just bizarre, but he's certainly
an interesting grab bag of ideas.
Yeah, he's sympathetic to some people on the right, and then you have alternatives to the right. You have Donald Trump's Truth Social. For a little while, you had the FBI watch list, also known as what was the name of it? Parler. But you have these sorts of things that crop up, and they exist. And if you want it, you can choose it. Just like you can choose to turn off the TV during the, Dick Gephardt commercial or whatever. You don't have to. It's not like the only hotel in town. I mean, that is the point where government can get involved and say you can't turn someone away in a marketplace when it's something that is needed and so scarce that there are no other options. This is not the case. No one needs to be on social media. I'll say that again, because not enough people know. You don't need to be on social media. And if you want to be on social media, you got a lot of options. So you are not stuck with any particular one.
Before I go to you, Anthony, real quick, to steelman the argument about media and all of that, which I'm largely in agreement with, that the things that are often referenced as these behemoths of the mainstream media have just by and large have never been less powerful than they are right now because of the way that the media landscape has shifted. But take us back a few years to make the steelman version of this point. The things that you named are the exception, that you have one cable network that is conservatively aligned, whereas you have, at least from a news perspective, people would argue ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, MSNBC, CNN at a minimum. From a newspaper perspective, yes, you are correct that you have the Wall Street Journal, but there is the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Chicago Tribune and the LA Times that, there's a sense of lacking in, I guess, fairness and balance, to borrow a phrase, of how many there are advancing one political viewpoint versus these large, possibly because they're consolidated around a single entity, the Roger Ailes quip that he discovered a niche audience, half the country. But when you're the only major network providing that, you're going to get all those people congregating around it.
At the time that was published, I think it was 2015, I wrote a little follow-up for what was then the Acton blog saying, what this tells me is that there is room on the conservative side of the media market to diversify the market in a similar way. Unfortunately, I was right, because now we have Newsmax and we have, like a billion, we got a ton of more conservative. And then if you look medium, it depends on the medium. So talk radio, like 80% conservative, right? And it's always been that way. So just because conservatives are more likely to listen to the radio or a podcast and not read a newspaper doesn't mean mainstream anyway, I don't want to get on that hobby horse again, but you get my point. So I see where people are coming from. It's not to say that the New York Times is unimportant. The whole point is just to say what is also important is all the real conservative media out there, and that's true of social media as well.
And the general point I always make is that, like, you are absolutely correct that the New York Times is important, but it has never been less important from an agenda-setting perspective than it is right now, because of the way that media is so diversified and so balkanized. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily a good thing, the way that the media environment has evolved, but it nonetheless is true.
I have three things here. I think the lawsuits primarily come out of a place of jealousy. You said mad, Eric. I think they're just jealous. They're just jealous in part because they didn't do it first. I mean, do you honestly think that if these social media giants had been developed by conservatives, and then conservatives were keeping progressives from publishing content on all these conservative founded platforms, that conservatives would be offering lawsuits to get progressive voices on the conservative platforms? That just wouldn't be happening at all. And really, you sort of think about, guys, listen, if you want to play fair in a marketplace, if you're all about the market and freedom and things like that, then you have to allow the possibility they just beat you at it, right? They're better at it than conservatives. And so if conservatives want platforms where their ideas get out to the masses, do it better, right? Conservatives do it better than X, do it better than Instagram and do it better and compete, right? I would say man up and go ahead and do that. So that's the first thing. I think secondly, and this is and by the way, on the second point, I'm not making a value judgment. It's a distinction between conservatives and classical liberals, right? And here's the distinction. I always say, if you want to get this distinction really clear, just watch the intern debates between the Cato Institute and the Heritage Foundation. You'll see this distinction I'm about to make. So the classical liberal is much more open to a competitive information marketplace that says, hey, listen, like I said earlier, what we don't want is government to determine what our speech ought to be. And so fair play. Create Parler, create X, create Facebook, and let the chips fall where they lie. And if one's more dominant in the marketplace than others, then so be it. What we don't want is a society where the state is coercively telling companies, private companies, what they can and can't do. I think people forget that Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, these are basically a bunch of nerds in a basement doing coding. That's all this is.
They can afford more than a basement at this point.
That's
but yes.
right.
My long run joke about Jack Dorsey, who is the founder and creator of Twitter, is that with only the billions of dollars he's made from it to wipe his tears away, I imagine him waking up in a cold sweat at 3 a.m. every once in a while, realizing he created the thing that got Donald Trump elected president.
Yeah. And by the way, they've been really good at it.
Yeah.
Right? Now conservatives historically, and we see this in the lawsuits from Texas and Florida, conservatives are much more willing to use the power of the state to advance their ideas and their causes. So that's a key difference. So what we're seeing here really is a difference between someone like Elon Musk, who's much more classical liberal on the speech platform, which is why he allows varying voices to be expressed on that, versus a more conservative approach, which is we're going to use the power of the state to fashion and shape what we want to happen in the marketplace of ideas. They're much more willing to do that, and classical liberals are not. I'll give you a great example. There's an organization that we're all familiar with called the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, FIRE, and this is their statement on free speech, particularly as it relates to these cases. I'll just read it here really, really briefly. We must resist the impulse to invoke coercive state power to force social media platforms to host or publish content they may wish to restrict. 2 states have already attempted to do exactly that. And this is their basic point. Any government intrusion into platforms' editorial discretion threatens platforms' own expressive rights under the First Amendment, and potentially that of other speakers. Solutions that reduce the scope and power of the First Amendment are likely to be no solutions at all, and their effects will almost certainly reverberate beyond social media. So here we have a very clear expression that we don't want the coercive power of the state to force social media platforms to host or publish content that other people want to restrict. We don't want to go down that road because, folks, I can tell you this, it won't stop at social media, right? It's going to extend to other things. And this is something I learned years ago from Doug Bandow at Cato. You don't ever want to give the state the power to do X or Y, because as soon as you give them the power to do X or Y, they aren't going to take it back, right? And so we need to ask the question, do we want a society where the coercive power of the state is going to be used to tell private companies how they can run the speech of their company? Do we want that? Or are we willing to allow these companies to let the market decide if the content that they publish is objectionable or not? And by that content, I mean political content, right? And just to let the chips fall where they lie. Those are my three things.
I just like to add an example because I think because they're the biggest, they got the most heat earliest on. Facebook actually has a standardized policy for how they deal with political advertisements in an election year. So it probably got heat in 2016. They made this policy, I believe, in 2020 and applied it there. But within a week of an election, they put a freeze on all new political ads, meaning political ads can still run, but you can't put a new one out without enough time to fact check it before people go to voting booths, which I think is very responsible, but that's their own self-developed program. But again, that's great. It's great that companies are actually trying, and they can compete for the best policy. And I think Facebook actually has a pretty responsible one.
Yeah, Twitter and X actually had, I don't know if it still is under Elon Musk's ownership, but their policy was that they just do not do that kind of advertising at all whatsoever, which is another choice and another direction that they could go. I have one thing real quick, which is there's kind of a cutting off your nose to spite your face element of all of this to me, which is speaking as a digital marketer. The power that Facebook represented to build digital communities around issues and ideas and organize and activate people for the purpose of, when I was in Illinois, trying to stop bad legislation or trying to pass good legislation was enormous. It was probably the most valuable tool after the email lists that we had built, that we had for the furtherance of those purposes. And because there are some people who think that their reach was smaller than it should have been, they got very, very mad, as I said, and decided that we now need some kind of legislation guaranteeing that conservative viewpoints can be heard on there. The last thing I'll add, and I'll go to you, Anthony, we'll move to the final topic, is what I like and what you were referencing there, Dylan, is I think if they were to just release, and even if it were 400 pages long, the rules that these companies are going to use to determine what stays up and what gets taken down, when people get banned and when they don't, I think everybody would chill out a good amount. Because even if it was long and complex, at least we have a chance to know what the rules are. And I think to borrow from one of my favorite cartoons as a child that is also often invoked by Charlie Cook over at National Review as a way to describe these things, this is Calvin ball. It is just the rules do not exist. It is all made up as they go along. And the more that they could do, I would like to see it aligned, generally speaking, with First Amendment principles, with general First Amendment jurisprudential principles. I think that'd be the easiest and clearest way for these companies to articulate what the parameters are going to be. But even if they're going to get more complex than that, just tell everybody what the rules are, and we can stop wondering and arguing about what we think they might be.
And in fairness, these platforms are incredibly influential. We don't want to ignore the fact that they do have the power to motivate large groups of people to do things, right? I mean, the marketing companies, the for-profit businesses out there who are advertising know this. And that's why they advertise, because they know that these platforms have the power to shape what people do and how they think. And having said that, I think there is, and I understand the impulse. I mean, there really is like, oh my gosh, we got to do something. But the question is, what should we do? And I think what FIRE says is much more something that I would celebrate. And they conclude by saying that it is preferable to advocate for voluntary measures, Dylan, like you said, voluntary measures for social media companies to protect free speech culture in terms of service and indeed. So we want X, we want Facebook, we want TikTok, and we want all of these companies to voluntarily do the right thing. Now, that requires some sort of moral introduction of principles and virtues and values so that voluntary, the application of those voluntary measures is actually good and virtuous. That's what we want. Now, I would also advocate that what we actually need, if conservatives are really interested in this, they need to be encouraging more and more conservatives to go into social media as a career, as a vocation, right, as a business, to introduce some diversity into the space. In fact, what would it look like to introduce those who care about these sorts of issues as employees, really capable, good employees at some of these companies to influence the culture that way so that these voluntary measures are the norm rather than the exception.
Let's move now to our final topic, and one that have really been itching to talk about because it involves Wendy's. And I think Wendy's, to me, is inarguably the best of the fast food restaurants. At least it's my favorite. I evaluate these things on a scale that I call the regret quotient, which is how soon after eating the food there do I regret the decision. For example, for McDonald's, instantaneous. For Wendy's, rarely do I feel that regret feeling. So I have a high opinion of Wendy's. But they were under fire last week for what is, and I'll just be clear about this up front, and I'll read some from this piece in Fortune, was largely a misunderstanding and was a case of terrible reporting on what was actually announced. So Wendy's had announced they would embrace dynamic pricing. Wendy's then went on to backtrack in saying that any comparison to companies like Uber and the idea of their surge pricing, anybody who's used Uber or Lyft will probably be familiar when they're, basically the laws of supply and demand. When there are fewer drivers out there and there's more demand than there is supply, the price goes up. Which the whole point of that is to incentivize more drivers to get out there because they have an opportunity to make more than the average ride would cost when there is lower demand. The clarification came after a deluge of criticism that included everyone from peers to Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, who wrote on X on Wednesday morning, "Wendy's is planning to try out surge pricing. That means you could pay more for your lunch, even if the cost to Wendy's stays exactly the same. It's price gouging, plain and simple, and American families have had enough." So this reporter here at Fortune had reached out to Wendy's which is aiming for $2 billion in global digital sales by the end of the year. To get the full story, a spokesman sent this person a statement that included Wendy's will not implement surge pricing, which is the practice of raising prices when demand is highest. We didn't use that phrase, nor do we plan to implement the practice. What they have said they're going to do is roll out these enhanced menu boards that are going to allow them to dynamically change pricing and the offerings depending on the time of day. So the way they characterized it as digital menu boards could allow us to change the menu offerings at different times of day and offer discounts and value offers to our customers more easily, particularly in the slower times of day. So this did... It is one of those stories that I love because the meme value of it was so incredibly high. So if people have not seen, like, you know, the screen caps from the movie Wall Street talking about buying the dip on the Baconator, you know, the first thing that popped into my head was Baconator Arbitrage. Like, what an opportunity we have here. Or the even, to me, the best ones are, if you haven't seen the movie Margin Call, which I think came out in 2015. It's a really good movie. But the Jeremy Irons' character saying the reason I get paid the big bucks is because it's my job to predict how much the Baconator will be surging a week from now, a month from now, a year from now. And right now, my Wendy's app is telling me it's not surging at all. So the meme value of this was incredible. But the reason I wanted to discuss it is not because of the misunderstanding in the reporting here, although I think the journalism side of the story is interesting and a bad representation of the kind of journalism that surrounds this. But to ask the question, should Wendy's implement surge pricing? Because I think they should. Because of the same reason I detailed earlier with Uber and Lyft, which is there are costs that are going to be associated no matter what, right? So one of the forms that the cost comes in is if it is a high demand period of time, you're going to wait longer. The price discrimination part of it is a way to address that. So I guess in that sense, I'm not opposed to the idea of Wendy's raising prices a little bit at times when demand is much higher in order to level all of that out. I don't see the huge problem with all of that. Now, I recognize that the kind of pushback against it will be exactly the kind of pushback that we saw, which is to say, like, the burger is going to cost the same thing to them. Okay, sure, but
how many people are working?
How many people are working?
There's a difference of labor. There's all sorts of reasons.
There's all sorts.
Elizabeth Warren is once again wrong about economics.
Well, and I would say that because anybody who has followed Elizabeth Warren's career sufficiently, I think, knows at this point is she is wrong, but it's worse than that. She's lying.
Yeah, I think she's cynical.
She knows that this is not true. And she even knows the underlying, look, you could just make a point and say it's like, the underlying economics of it may make sense, but it's a bad idea from a public relations perspective to say that the burger is going to be $10 at noon
so I'll make that
rather
point.
than at $5, what it's normally priced at. It's a perfectly legitimate argument to make, but it is not an economics argument. It is a public relations argument.
Right. So to be clear, what they are doing is they're going to use digital menu boards, maybe AI, to offer like a happy hour. Like that's the essence of this. It's like when the Krispy Kreme siren is going and they got the free donuts or whatever. They're getting into that game, and that's a normal thing.
And you would also have, there are certain things that will sell more and sell less. So you could have the opportunity to use those boards to clear inventory on certain things by decreasing the price of it.
Yeah, you say big sale on nuggets at the moment because we got a bunch of them just sitting under the hot lights.
We got to move them.
Now my first job was at Wendy's, so I'm very grateful to the Wendy's enterprise. I think Dave Thomas was a great guy. And I got my start there. I was 15 when I first started working there. I think real surge pricing would be bad. And the reason is purely practical. It's not a principled thing. I think it's fine to try it out. But I don't think it would work because people like seeing an advertisement and saying, oh, Junior Bacon Cheeseburgers are 99 cents again. I'm going to go there whenever I feel like it, and that's exactly how much I will pay. If you want to put together an advertisement for your new specialty bacon mushroom Swiss, and it ends by saying, come see how much it costs when you show up. Who knows what that will be? That's just not very marketable. And people will be like, you know what, I'll just go to McDonald's and get a McChicken because I know exactly what that's going to cost. So I think the happy hour sort of thing, that can absolutely work, and I'm excited to see if this, is a way to add more efficiency to, I think, a very important industry. I will make a very slight soapbox statement because I've made it around the office. I made it on our blog before years ago. But fast food is a public service. It may be unhealthy. It may be bad in all the ways people say. But if you're like a single mother and your kid drops the lasagna and you're like, oh my gosh, I just got to feed this kid before bedtime, a place that you can just drive through and in 3 minutes get them a Happy Meal and put them to bed, like that is a public service, and I will defend them. There are plenty of people who abuse fast food and who don't treat themselves well and all of that. Very true. Very true. I'm not saying that, there's no personal responsibility, but there is a real public service here.
It's like that Super Size Me film that I always found to me the real interesting part was he started with this, like, McDonald's claims that you can eat it for every meal of the day and it's perfectly healthy. I'm like, I don't think they ever said that.
Yeah.
But sure, make it the subject of a documentary where you abuse your own body for our entertainment.
I would love for us to have dynamic pricing be more of the public vocabulary. I think because the market works that way anyway. I mean, Wendy's already does dynamic pricing. It just does it much more slowly than we're used to seeing. It's over seasons and months. This is why there are some sandwiches. I'll use another brand, McDonald's. That's why the McRib is only offered certain parts of the year or certain years, and then it disappears, right? I mean, this is a normal part of how markets work. The change is it might be more instantaneous and immediate. I mean, that's the change. And the awesome part is that people have options. It's pretty rare in this country for a fast food restaurant to not be in proximity to other fast food restaurants. It's almost like car dealerships. So if you walk into Wendy's in that particular time, the Baconator is more expensive, literally go across the street or go down the street and go to Arby's or Taco Bell and do something and get something else, right? And so people still have options. I think Senator Warren needs to know that people still have options. They have agency, and they can go look somewhere else. I think the dynamic pricing also, in the long run, is going to save consumers money because you can go when it's cheaper. It really is. I think happy hour is the right framework. And if you don't want to get the surge price Baconator at noon, then don't do it. Make a sandwich. Do something else. But if you want to get it at 4:30 when nobody usually goes, you can go take advantage of it at that particular time. And of course, as we know, in the food industry, there's sort of peaks and valleys in terms of activity. And so not only is it going to be the case that the meal might be more expensive at noon, there's also more employees working at noon. There's more cost. And it's going to look in real time about supply issues, right? If they don't have enough of something, they're going to cut back. If they have a surplus, price is going to go down. So it's just bringing it to the forefront for consumers in ways that we just aren't used to seeing, but it's not really that different than what we already experienced. When you go to Amazon to get a book, you really don't know how much that book is going to cost until you actually click on the book.
Yeah.
And it could be one price at noon and another price at 6 o'clock, and the next day it could be on sale for 40% off. And so we actually already do this. We're just not used to seeing it in the fast food industry.
I think something to underscore how people seem to not think about this in the most helpful ways, or at least the way that economic illiteracy seems to run the day. This was another there were a couple of fast food related viral things that I've seen on social media in the last couple of days. One of them was about like just what the general price is to get a burger, fries, and a drink from Five Guys, which again, from a brand distinguishing and marketing standpoint, attempting to compare Five Guys to like even just current McDonald's or Burger King is to misunderstand the category that they're operating in. They are a fast casual restaurant. Those places like Chipotle do cost you a little bit more, but it is offering a completely different experience to you than you would get at a Burger King or a McDonald's, and that's kind of their brand prop. It's their selling point. And there's something to be said about the fact that Five Guys does not seem to be failing. So to quote the great Milton Friedman, I think people tend to value what they get at the price that they pay for it. And there is nothing out there to suggest to me that by and large people think the cost of a burger from Five Guys is too high, because they keep going there and they keep buying it. Now, the other one, which I again thought was funny and shows how people will look at the raw numbers and again not think about how things have changed. It's this receipt from a Burger King that has been going around that is from 1986. And the order is for 3 Whoppers, 2 fries, and like the 2 large vanilla, I suppose they're shakes. The cost of this in 1986 is $7.98, after tax $8.39. Again, that is in 1986. We can clarify this in 2 ways. One, it took me all of about 10 seconds to punch those numbers into an inflation calculator. $8.39 in 1986 dollars compared to 2024. $23.61. We're welcome to have a conversation about the problems created by inflation, but at least understand that, that's pretty much the exact price that you would pay now. There's almost no difference to it whatsoever. Or another way of thinking about it, as pointed out by Jeremy Horpdahl, was a good follow on Twitter, and I recommend him. The average hourly wage in 1986 was $7.87, which means it took slightly more than 1 hour of labor to buy that meal from Burger King in 1986. The average hourly wage today is $29.66. And you can buy the same meal for $27.19 at his local Burger King, less than an hour of labor.
Yeah, I was going to say it's cheaper today.
It has become, even with inflation being what it is cheaper today based on, this is why I've always liked Don Boudreau's work on this, of trying to understand these things in terms of how many labor hours you have to work in order to make the purchase. And I love the caveat that, Burger King, at least somewhat comparative enough in terms of the product you were buying in 86 versus the product you're buying now. All the other stuff that you have to make comparisons for, you have to work a couple of hours in order to buy a 40-inch television, whereas you would, I'm making these numbers up. Go look at Cafe Hayek, Don Boudreau's blog to get the exact numbers on it. But, a week in order to purchase a television back then. And the thing that you can't control for in that example, the television now is so much better than the one that you would have purchased in the 1980s.
I've mentioned this before in this podcast, but a few months ago, I was up late and I had, I think, Roku, which is free. And there was like a Price is Right channel for some reason. It was like I turned off my kids, sent them to bed, whatever, and it just defaulted to that. And the big prize for one of the games was a furniture TV / Betamax set. So this is like early 80s. Bob Barker's hair was still black. And he's betting, and he has to, there's the price keeps going up. He has to tell it to stop. He has it stop at like $9,000 or something like that. And he was too low. It was $10,000 in the 1980s for a screen that is smaller than any TV that anybody has today. And this weird, you have to reserve a whole quarter of a room to put this, that we just hang them on the wall now. I was watching this on a screen that was unimaginable for anyone at the time. It speaks to that in industries like technology, like fast food, which are not heavily regulated, unlike, say, education or healthcare. We see nothing but things getting cheaper and better for consumers.
Well, it's cheaper. I don't know that it's healthier.
Fair.
The food.
Fair.
Right? I mean, they cook their fries in seed oils. It'd be great if they could go back to beef tallow. That'd be more healthy. The bread's full of high fructose corn syrup. It'd be great if they could go back to, So it's not necessary. It is cheaper. It is cheaper. It is less healthy as well.
I don't necessarily disagree with any of that. I think it is interesting, though, that it has been in the cause of public health that they moved away from all of those things, which is, to me, a strike against just the general idea of these encouragements by public health activists and officials to move us in a certain direction because of how often they've been wrong, right? I'm old enough to remember when it was like butter's bad, eat margarine, margarine's bad, eat butter. You go back and forth. Eggs are bad, eggs are good, eggs are, I don't know, there's something, man. But the I think that's an entirely fair point, but I think it's worth pointing out that, it was the cause of public health that got us to something less healthy, which is a reason, I think, to offer some skepticism on the way that we're being pushed around about health and nutrition in a general way.
For me, the good news is that if everybody does dynamic pricing, those people that have the least amount of margin in terms of dollar in pocket are going to benefit the most. Because the competitive environment is going to be on fire to get consumers in the door, which means that if there's a cluster, and there are some neighborhoods like this, there are clusters of fast food restaurants within half a mile of each other, clusters of them. If they're all competing at 3 o'clock or 6 o'clock or noon for the same community of people to come in the doors, this dynamic pricing could really help the people who need it the most.
We do this a little bit with gasoline. I remember years ago, like my stepdad and I would compete to see who could fill up for the lowest amount per gallon, right? And I was like, I knew exactly which neighborhood to drive to where it would be cheaper. And which gas station on which corner and all of that sort of thing. And it happened to be on my way to work or on my way home, so it worked out. But we have that sort of dynamic pricing now. That's more complicated because it's propped up by things like people in those neighborhoods are more likely to buy cigarettes and other unhealthy things, lotto tickets, whatever, So there's other unfortunate reasons for that dynamic pricing, but that dynamic pricing does exist in other ways. Maybe you need a board outside of the Wendy's telling you how many 9/10 of a cent the burger is going to be today, right?
Well, I want my Wendy's app to look more like my TD Ameritrade app. That's the inevitable outcome here. Two final quick points before we go. I think I may have lost the initial point that I was going to make.
Start with the second one, and we'll get back to it.
2 points before we go. The reason that I love the Uber and Lyft examples is because, again, it forces you to think about things in a way to weigh money and time. So I was out of town last week and needed to catch a car to the airport. I had plenty of time. My flight wasn't until later in the evening. And at the time I looked at the app, it was about $50 to get from where I was to the airport because it was around rush hour. I'm like, well, I can sit here for another 30 minutes and the price comes down by more than 50% over the course that I sat there. But it forced me to weigh a question of like, well, how much is my time valuable to me? I had plenty of it to expend there. Happy to sit around. I like how it forces people to think about those things. The other, and just so people can get a sense of this too, picking a random year of 1982, given you said it was early 1980s for this episode of The Price is Right, a $10,000 prize in 1982 would be almost $32,000 in 2024 bucks. And again, the point that you can't get over and you can't really adjust for is that the quality has so dramatically improved.
No one would pay that
time.
price for that TV furniture setuing today.
Exactly.
You'd have to pay someone to drive it away, which, according to Dan, is the definition of trash.
Having once had one of those back projection, gigantic 50-screen TVs that I got rid of before moving out of Chicago, I gave it away for free.
Yeah.
And the condition, free was the condition to tell them, you have to come and get it out of my condo.
Yep.
Like that, I had to give it away in order to get someone to come take it.
Yep.
Let's call it a wrap there. Thank you for listening to Acton Unwind. If you're listening to this podcast on our website, please look in the show notes for a link where you can subscribe directly to Acton Unwind or just search Acton Unwind on your favorite podcast app. Also, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, 5-star reviews only, so that more people can find our show. I also want to let you know that there will be a bonus Unwind episode coming out later this week, likely on Wednesday or Thursday, that is going to feature me, Dylan, Dan Huger, and producer Daniel discussing Dune 2. So watch your podcast feed for that. Thanks to Anthony. Thanks to Dylan for the Acton Institute. I'm Eric Cohn. We'll see you next week.